Here she comes.
It was the determined walk.
Very generous of you.
All right, public comment on study session item. Study session, and I guess I'll turn it over to.
Mr. Bouvier, you're ready.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
How you doing, Tom?
Good, thanks, good. Are you going to turn camera on your end? Just curious.
We're gonna make it keep guessing.
Okay.
Just talk.
It might not work that way because
We're gonna work on it on our end, Tom. But if you want to go ahead and
Sure thing. I'll get started. Thanks, everybody, for your time in coming for a Brown Act training. I would like to go around the room, even though I can't see you. I'd like to go around the room, and if you have burning questions that you brought today, I'll just please blurt them out, and I want to make sure I get them addressed as we go along. I find also that when I do Brown Act trainings that your questions really illuminate the fun topics that you want to talk about. So the more discussion and questions from your end, the more fun it'll be, in my humble opinion. For those of you that haven't met me, my name's Tom Gauthier with the Lozano Smith Law Firm. We've had the privilege of working with your schools for several years now. And the things that we're going to talk about today, you might be surprised to learn, are things that happen all day, every day in my job. I mean, I've just this morning, I was sending out a script for how to put together a couple of closed session agenda items, how to go in and out of closed session, and just helping folks dot the I's and cross the T's on that. So these things come up constantly, and there are no silly questions. So with just to set the stage, I'm going to also go over a few slides about the board's role and governance topics. I feel like as an experienced board, these are things that you probably already know quite well, but I did want to give a room for a discussion, a space for discussion about board governance issues and board's role a little bit. And then we'll go into the topics you see on this summary slide. Things about setting the agenda, and Michael and your staff are quite good at setting the agenda, but there's always questions that come up and things that you can fine tune. And board members often have questions about disruptions and people wanting to request agenda items and all kinds of things related to meeting conduct. So we'll talk about that. And then I also just seem to be inundated with questions about closed sessions and labor and employment and personnel closed sessions in particular. So got a few quizzes for you, a few true-false quizzes for you that you can work on. And then, you know, we can talk about return to governance questions at the end if there's time. Michael or Gary, do you want to take a break at about the hour mark, or do you want to plow on it? What's your preference there?
yeah, let's check in at the hour mark and see how everybody's doing.
Okay, great. So first thing I'm going to do is just talk about the board's role. You've probably seen some of these division of labor slides before and probably have talked about them quite a bit. And I know just from my own personal experience, when I was on the board of a charity, I found it difficult to get used to as a board member, that, you know, I didn't see all the operational stuff that I was used to seeing in other companies that I had worked with. So it does take some time to get used to, but I also think it helps keep from exhausting board members. And one of the most important things that boards do is hire the superintendent and set policy for the district. But that doesn't mean you can stay completely out of the loop on operational matters. For example, we're going to talk about closed session and personnel matters in closed session. And that's a place where staff can update you in some detail on what's going on, even if the board isn't, you know, 100% hands-on on personnel matters. So I want to pause there and see if there's any comments or questions from the board or Gary about board governance things that have been going on. Anything you want to discuss?
How's everybody feeling? I think that
Good.
you know, we've had a pretty healthy closed session lately in terms of the number of items that have come to us. So we've been pretty close in regards to making sure that we've got our I's dotted and T's crossed. But I think as Tom highlighted, just jump in with any wonderings or anything that we might want to have clarified.
Sure thing. When we get to closed session, I will also pause and encourage you to look at the PDF that I sent you, which is some excerpts from our Brown Act handbook. And our Brown Act handbook has the excerpts I sent you are the closed session agenda descriptions. And even if you do this day in and day out, and as I said, Michael and your staff are quite good at putting the agenda together, there's always questions as to like, okay, well, what do we put on the agenda? Do we announce something? Do we need to put the job title of someone? And so there's lots of questions like that. So we'll take a look at that. But back to what's on the slide here, again, from my own personal experience, it takes a little while to get used to the role of setting policy and not doing operations. But it does help set the tone for the district if you are clear in those lanes. And I haven't heard any concerns from you as a board or from your staff on that. But just again, wanted to pause and give you time for discussion if you need it. One of the other things that people perceive about you, as you can see on the slide, is people perceive that you're an elected official and that you can fix their problem. And of course, that's what you do. You petition your elected officials to take care of things. And so I think it's also important to have your own personal way of responding to constituents that might stop you at the grocery store or email you or message you on social media with district business. And I think it's important to make yourselves aware of the processes and be able to explain those processes to constituents and say, have you, as you well know, one of the first steps is to start at the lowest level. Have you, one of the questions you often ask is, have you spoken to the teacher? Have you spoken to the principal? Things like that. And it's also good to keep in mind that you have a whole raft of different policies for formal and informal complaints. So one of the things that I do in my job is a lot of times is spend time helping people who are very experienced at this even figure out like which policy do we apply and how do we respond to this complaint? Is it a formal complaint? Is it an informal complaint? But the point I'm making here on this slide is that people perceive that you can do something for them, and I think and you can, but it's collectively as a district and collectively as a board where you have the ability to act. So I think it's good to project that and say that as often as possible, so that people don't misperceive that talking to you for 5 minutes has somehow transferred their problem to your desk and is now on your desk, even though in a way it's on the district's desk. So I'll pause there again if there's any discussion or questions.
I think this is the stuff that's why Byron asked me personally and asked here in open session on public comment about having a portrait of a board member as being part of our portrait of series, because he is encountering a lot of staff that have a lot of questions or expectations of us that are not actually, he knows that it's not correct, but it's very hard to correct when they don't have a document they can refer to.
Yeah, and I've talked to Byron about this, and if he was here, I think he'd tell you the same. Like, we point them to our governance handbook. And our governance handbook essentially is our portrait of it includes, literally it includes our portrait of a graduate and a few other supporting documents. But like, that's the document when they ask, like, what is the role of the board? Like, here's this beautifully articulated document that we adopted and that should answer the majority of the questions. So like that document I think is beneficial to like having your back pocket.
And just out of curiosity, is that posted on our website very clearly somewhere?
It's posted under governance. It's almost you click governance and it's posted right there. People are able to click on it, download it. It's right on the website.
Would you mind sharing that with us as board members, just so that we can have it in our back pocket? Yeah. So when things do arise, we can just click.
Yep.
That's a helpful discussion, because I know that a lot of the information that people get about schools comes from either personal conversations or their kids' experience, or literally going to the website. I know when I'm doing work for schools, it's one of the first things I do is go find the board policies, go find the board agenda, go look at it. I did see your governance handbook on there, and it didn't take me long to find, so that's a good sign. Sometimes things can be hidden, but yours is easy to find, so good. That's all good.
It's gotten much better.
Yes.
Michaelin's done a great job with our website. It used to be hard to find stuff.
Okay, good.
It is-
Sorry, go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, just and real quick, on Thursday when you all consider adopting our strategic framework, I'll make reference of the governance handbook in relation to like the board's role. Like we also see you as leaders in the portrait of a leader, you know, but then I'll also make specific reference to the governance handbook if anybody is, you know, so inclined to wonder where the portrait of a board member is.
Okay, thank you. One of the other things that I think is helpful to think about when we're talking about board roles, and I don't have it on these slides, but I often speak in that way, because sometimes people will call legal and say, well, we've got this problem where a board member is a parent and there's a concern about this or that. And I always ask, what role do we think the board member is playing right now? Because you have your role right now, which is board member, but you also often have the role of community member or parent or volunteer. And I think sometimes it's helpful for board members to think of themselves in one of those roles. Because if you're acting as a board member, you're here at a board meeting or you're interacting with staff on board business. If you're a volunteer, you know, you're hanging up posters for the fall carnival, or one of hundreds of other things like that. If you're a parent, then you're stepping out of your board role and interacting with staff about your pupil. And if you find yourself not able to fit in one of those buckets, and you're saying, okay, I'm doing operations, then maybe you need to get back into one of those lanes and remind yourself to be in one of those buckets. That's just helpful for me to think about.
Sorry, with that comment, I think you're absolutely correct, but I think the problem is not from a board member's perspective. I think we all, at least in our current board, know where our lane is and how to stay in it. I think the problem is when the community doesn't see that you're a parent at that moment or you're a volunteer at that moment, because unfortunately they only see a board member. So I get it, but.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I find that it is not the folks in this room that need to be reminded of that. Sometimes it is other people, and people have a surprising concern all the time about the power that people exercise. And even though, you know, a couple of slides ago, we're talking about individual board members don't have power individually, they act collectively. It's hard for other people to perceive that when you're walking around campus, when you are interacting with a principal about your pupil and things like that. So the more you can say loudly and often, you know, what your role is and what the limits are, then it might help people be more accustomed to that. So you raise a good point, so that you don't have people overly concerned that, oh my gosh, here's a board member on campus, what's going on? You know, we all have that, you know, even though I've been in my organization for over 2 decades, you know, when the boss calls, everyone says, uh-oh, why is she calling? You know, that little bit of trepidation's always there. All right, I'm going to dive into some Brown Act basics. Gary, I'm just curious, are we going to be camera off, which is fine. I was just curious.
There's no way apparently to get it on while we're live streaming. So apologies for that, but I will I'll blurt in, Tom. You know me.
No problem. No worries. Just curious. I know I have had to work out each detail of all the technological features of every platform several times in the past few years. You think after 4 or 5 years of Zoom, it would all be exact, but no, it happens all the time. Basics here on this slide, things you already know. One thing at the bottom of the slide is the agenda is posted on the website. The agenda packet does not have to be posted on the website, and many of you many districts are and make that a practice. So just keep in mind, the agenda is posted in hard copy and on the website, not the agenda packet. The reason I bring that up is the agenda packet can be more fluid, and sometimes things get added at the last minute, which is fine in human nature. Just make sure that you are updating the packet that if you email it to people, make sure you send an updated version, make sure the website gets updated, because there actually have been a couple of court cases about last minute additions to the agenda packet if they're not promptly added to the website. And it is also perfectly acceptable to walk things into a board meeting if you're a guest speaker and you don't get your things into the agenda packet. It's perfectly fine to walk things into a board meeting and say, here, I'd like to show you these slides or hand out this document, as long as you make a copy available for the public as soon as you can by hard copy or by just displaying it. So we just want to make sure that people have access to every document that the board sees for open session. And I think that's the point I want to leave you with, that everything that the board gets for open session, that's the agenda packet. Closed session, not so much. We'll talk about that because that is, of course, confidential. Question for the group. Have you had much in the way of disruptions at board meetings or going off topic or people getting combative, anything like that?
Yeah.
Somewhat, yeah.
Somewhat.
Nothing compared to what we read about
Another
down
one.
south or
Yeah,
in
no one's taking
the
off
central part of the
clothes or-
valley. For the most part, folks up here have been pretty well behaved. No, you can get a little
Okay.
squirrely every once in a while, but
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Good.
think and I think the best thing too is or the one thing that always stands out to me is that people seem to get annoyed that we don't respond because they don't understand the process not that we don't want to, is that we can't respond or interact.
That's a good discussion point, and I have a slide on it, of quite a few slides forward from here, but I would like to address that because some people are brought up to understand that you never respond to public comment, and you can. The Brown Act allows you to do several things: refer things to staff, number one; number two, ask that something be put on a future agenda, respond briefly, and so it can be strategic and useful to respond to people if they brought a problem to you and you can't discuss all the details or don't have it on the agenda, so there's no long discussion available. But it could very well be that you say, oh, yes, Superintendent Stortz is well versed in that. It's been a topic of discussion. I'd like you to talk to Gary over there after the board meeting. Something very short like that can be helpful, as long as you do it judiciously and you don't act like or seem like you're arguing with people about their concerns, and that just makes people feel heard. So I don't know, Gary, if you and your staff have a practice of doing that. Sometimes, maybe never. Just curious.
Tom, I've inherited kind of like a preamble that we read that basically says, hey, we're not going to respond to public comment, which I think, is the safest of options. Now, I agree with you. I think that I don't know if that would leave me feeling heard. If I'm going to get out of dinner, away from my kids and come have a conversation. I think there's a happy medium in there. But that said, we need to revisit that, with our governance norms.
But
and
I think we
rules
do what he was talking about. I mean, there are times when somebody's brought something and we've said, Gary, could you please follow up on that and talk to this gentleman or send him the right person to talk to, and you'll say yes, or can you look into that? We'll do things like that, but not
Or
really.
you will direct them to talk to a different staff member
Sure.
that would be appropriate.
Sure.
We've also had, I can remember a couple in not too long ago where we would actually go, is there a way we could put that on a future agenda? And one person asking that without significant discussion should fit in this too.
100%.
Yeah.
I think it would be nice a lot of times, especially if people are really emotional, to have one of us just be able to say, thank you for bringing this to our attention, we've heard you, or something along those lines, because I agree with you, I think people just don't feel heard. I mean, even if they totally understand the process, it's still really unsatisfying to throw your emotions out, and they spend a lot of time writing this up, they're very passionate about it, and to spit it all out, and then there's no response at all. I just think it would be really nice for just one of us to be able to say, thank you, write something up maybe that we can say, we all agree on, we've heard you, we're glad you brought this to our attention, or something like that. I don't know.
I would offer that I would, if an individual board member feels so inclined to ensure that somebody feels heard, or somebody was going to follow up with them or something, that it not be a script, that it needs to feel authentic, and it needs to feel genuine, so that would be my
I think we
approach,
have done
but,
that.
I think that you have as well. I think our preamble reads a little
It's a little harsh.
A little,
Yeah.
reads a little different than how we practice.
Yeah,
it.
and I think we've definitely had situations where not every situation needs an answer. I mean, you've
No,
been
that's
here
true.
in meetings where we get very random comments and we're like, that has nothing to do with us.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah.
Right. What
But
are you gonna say to
usually,
that?
the president of the board, at least after having called them up and they get finished with their time, usually
Thank
we
you.
say
Just say
something
thank
like,
you.
thank you, or thank
Yeah.
you for coming,
Yeah.
something like that. And then if they ask a more direct question, that they really want an answer to, we do have to have
I feel
some
like
way to respond.
Yeah, I feel like I've even said, please email me.
Yeah, you're not very good about that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's a good discussion. And I agree with the direction that you've been going and maybe are going. I heard the words happy medium from Gary, and I agree. It seems like the best use of responses is to say something empathic, like thank you for your comments. I remember I said that one time, which is usually not my place to speak up, but someone came and spoke passionately about how they were bullied in high school, and it just really moved me. I said, thank you for your comments. I'm really, really glad you shared your experience. That was it. Or as you board members have already said, just referring someone to HR or the superintendent just really briefly without engaging in a dialogue. Because even if there's a short dialogue about a topic, other members of the public don't know that they need to be there for it. So if you get even 2 or 3 minutes into discussion about it, then it's not on the agenda, so people don't know this important discussion is happening here. So happy medium was a good word, Gary. Alrighty, so just want to talk about the agenda for a little bit, some basics. Also, the things that I've touched on here are the ones that I've seen become questions or concerns. You still have to post your agenda in hard copy in a location that's accessible for the whole 72 hours. Also, people get to request that all government services need to be accessible. I'll back up a second. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires that local governments make their services accessible. And that means dozens of things, but one of it is the agenda and materials need to be available in alternative formats that are machine readable for persons with visual impairments or hearing impairments. And those requests happen. Occasionally, people ask for sign language interpreters at a board meeting, things like that. So just be ready for that if you're not already. Just think about your resources. Fortunately, it's getting easier and easier with software to make all the materials on your website accessible to persons with disabilities. I realize now I don't recall how you handle public comment. On this slide, this is a mantra for many agenda items. Usually, it's helpful to just go through each agenda item in the same business-like fashion, which usually looks like what you see here. Staff talks about it, board asks questions and discusses, then you call for public comment. The reason I put an asterisk there is, do you call for public comment at each agenda item, or do you have public comment all happen at the beginning?
Each item.
Each item.
Okay. Each item.
There's a space for public comment on non-agenda items, and then there's a space for public comment on agenda items as well.
Okay, good. Both ways are fine. I have found pros and cons to both. If you do what you're doing, it does lengthen your board meetings a little bit, but it also makes the public comment more relevant to your agenda item. If you put all public comment at the beginning, some boards find it helpful because then folks that are, as you say, missing dinner or homework or extracurriculars don't have to wait till 8:30 to get public comment. So pros and cons to both. Well, it's just fine. Oh, also not on the slides, but one thing that's come up recently is occasionally you're required to do public hearings. And for example, the legislature recently required a public hearing for adoption of independent study policies. And I put air quotes around public hearing just because we've actually seen California Department of Education and other officials say, oh, wait a minute, your agenda didn't say public hearing on it, therefore you didn't have a public hearing. So it's just one of those things every now and then if you're looking at an environmental impact report or adopting certain policies, you need to have a public hearing. And that generally means you label it on the agenda and you also stop and say, we're going to open the public hearing. Is there any comment? And you close the public hearing and move on. It's usually not a huge change in procedure, but I just want to point that out. It's always good to pause and think about things that have a public hearing requirement attached to them. One of the other things to keep in mind is you want to make sure your agenda is flexible enough to allow you to either discuss or take action or both. The reason I pause on this point is the Brown Act does say the agenda has to list the business to be transacted or discussed, as you see in quotes on this slide. And so it should be clear whether it's conference or action, or it could be either. And one area where I think that might be important is like board policies, for example. If the board policy is routine, you can often by policy just waive the second reading. Well, if you want to waive the second reading, you want to make sure that your agenda item for the first reading says conference possible action. And just want to make sure that is all in line. Any questions or comments there?
Seeing none.
Okay. Brown Act actually says generally 20 words or less, as long as it's descriptive. And for some reason, the legislature has put in the education code that members of the public have the right to place items on the agenda, but there's no similar rule for other local governments, at least not the ones I'm aware of. So it's a unique rule, and people I think, use it more often. One of your board bylaws tracks this and says, basic things like you got to get it in within a certain time, and the board decides whether it's under their jurisdiction. And also you get to decide, what the items look like. Is it going to be just an information item that a member of the public speaks to? Is it going to be an actual discussion item? And of course, you still retain jurisdiction to decide whether you want to act on something. So I'm wondering if you've had many requests for agenda items lately, and whether you want to discuss how that rolls at all.
I think so, because one of the things that I think has happened that is always makes you uncomfortable, you're sitting or you're in a board meeting and somebody will come up and talk about something and then say, I want this on the agenda, and we're all looking at each other like, how do we go about that? I mean, then is that the time to tell that person, okay, then give what you want on the agenda to Michael and we'll review it for the next agenda, or what do we say when that happens?
That's a great question, and I think it's board bylaw 9323 or 9322, whatever your board meeting conduct or board meeting agenda bylaw is, and it typically says the request should be placed in writing and it should be given to the district or the superintendent a certain number of days in advance. I don't recall what yours says on that point. So to answer your question, I think that's the time to say, if you want to request an agenda item, please know there's a process for that. You should speak to Michael and Harris, and you need to get it in writing. Thank you. something that short to do.
And then Tom, I don't remember board policy 9322 word for word. Slap my hand.
But neither do I.
When we say may, so Joe Public comes and says I want to talk about whatever. They go through the process, and then there's still discretion.
Yes, on the slide here, there's discretion to decide whether something is under your jurisdiction. And I'll give you an example. There's a court case where a member of the public wanted to change the character of a school event. There was something, I believe, that was a pride event, and they wanted to change it to something else. And the school board said, we're not going to give you an agenda item about one school event. And the reason that the court said that was okay is, even though things that go on at school are generally under the board's jurisdiction, there was no evidence that the board actually took up micromanaging specific school events. And so sometimes there's also really clear examples where someone wants you to take a stand on state legislation or federal policy, for example, and you can say that's that's not something that comes before the board. That we may write a letter to the legislature, but we don't really talk about our position on legislation in board meeting. So those are some examples.
Thank you.
And I think also sometimes people want to talk about things that touch on personnel that you can't discuss in open session. So I think you can say, well, I'll give you an agenda item and maybe say it's a community concern about topic X, and you can speak to it, but the board's not going to be able to discuss it because it's a personnel matter. That's another way to handle it.
Or they can bring that in public comment, right?
Well, exactly right. I think, and sometimes people debate whether you should just say go to public comment, but I think if it's a valid agenda item, often a good practice is to say, I'll give you an agenda item, and I'll label it on the agenda, but it's going to look a lot like public comment because you're going to speak, and we're going to say thank you. And just helping them understand the limits of the discussion that you are allowed to engage in, I think is helpful. Okay, and question for the group, whether you want to spend a lot of time on acting on non-agendized items. Some districts do this on an occasional basis, some almost never, and I'm wondering if this is almost never for you, we could move on to the next topic, but it's up to you.
Remember ever acting.
Yeah, this is an almost never.
Okay, well then I'll just pause real briefly. We talked about 4 and 5 on this slide. Even if it's not on the agenda, you can respond to public comments and questions briefly. You can have a discussion about whether to put something on a future agenda. And that comes up sometimes where either because of public comment or board member discussion, you say, yeah, you know what, superintendent, we probably need to have this on the agenda in the future. So those are things that you can do. The held over items one is pretty rare and is usually for really large organizations where they have frequent meetings. And emergencies, thankfully, the last time I can think of school boards having an emergency meeting was when Oroville Dam was about to break. Remember that a few years ago? There was a lot of emergency meetings that day, and thankfully you don't see that very often. The one that does come up occasionally is subsequent need items, and what that looks like is you need to make a finding of immediate action, and that the need arose and came to the attention of the entire agency after the agenda was posted, and it also requires a 2/3 vote. So it doesn't happen very often, but one example is maybe you suddenly realize you need to act to approve a grant agreement and get a grant agreement in place before the deadline passes or something like that. So that is something that comes up once in a while. In my experience, you can usually schedule a special meeting right before or right after your regular meeting, take it that way. That's usually a little easier way to go. Okay. So this is a mantra that many board governance workshops focus on. And I already asked you a question about whether you had a lot of disruptive comments. You said very little, which is good. I think it's also helpful to go through the mantra from a few slides ago, right here, which is running through an agenda item in the same business-like fashion each way. I think helps people understand when it's time for them to give public comment. It helps everyone stay on track with agenda items. But one of the things that sometimes happens at school board meetings is folks are there, often staff that have helpful comments, and they pop up from the audience and say, oh yeah, I want to talk about the 5th grade field trip. And there's nothing wrong with letting people break in, but sometimes it can be overdone, and it looks more like a town hall or a public meeting. So I think it is helpful to remember that mantra, which is, this is our meeting, it's conducted in public, and we want to hear your input, and it's very important, and it happens in very specific ways. Now, on this agenda item, or excuse me, on this slide, I think Gary already touched on this, that you know perfectly well you have the right to have space for public comment on anything, whether it's on the agenda or not at the beginning, and then you allow public comment during each agenda item. I think that's a fine way to go. Keep in mind, the general public comment session that you're talking about, you only have to do that at a regular meeting. At a special meeting, you can limit public comment just to agenda items. I find a lot of districts still allow the general public comment at special meetings just because they want to be more transparent. That's fine, too. Okay, and we already talked about this from a little while ago. The Brown Act specifically says all these things. I thought you had a really helpful discussion about parameters for responding. So I don't have anything else to add there unless you do.
On that last one, it said that the public has to comment on anything within the district's jurisdiction. I know it's just 3 minutes, so we usually just let people talk, but sometimes people come and talk about something that has nothing to do with us. And it's like,
Yes.
talk about whippets and marijuana and just things that have nothing to do with us. Or what, space aliens are doing to your brain, or all kinds of crazy things that really have nothing to do with us. Can we tell them that has nothing to do with us, or is it just best to just listen for the 3 minutes?
A great question. And in my experience, most of the time people just listen because it's only 3 minutes and the person is not being rude. They're just a little off base perhaps. And so yeah, you can gavel them down, but people tend to dislike that, and it's also sometimes hard to break in. So I see most boards just kind of nodding and saying thank you, and occasionally saying, I appreciate your comments, but I just want you to know we don't have anything to do with zoning. You may want to contact the city, something like that.
I mean,
So yeah.
on that note, I guess there's one thing that more of a thought process that if you could walk me through, that'd be awesome. But sometimes when I find myself when I have an engaging parent that is here speaking on something that they're truly passionate about and I want to hear them out as a board member, But when the 3-minute timer is up, I find it really hard to cut them off sometimes, but at the same time, I know that we have to follow protocol with treat everybody exactly the same. It makes it difficult as the president currently to cut them off when we have like the person that comes that talks about nothing. It's very easy for me to cut them off at the 3-minute mark and say we're moving on. Is there a way that you would address that, or I mean, if you were in my place, what
I
would you do?
empathize with your situation because the school board meetings that I go to, that's exactly what happens. People go on a little bit past the 3 minutes, and that's not because they want to take up extra time, it's just because they haven't quite finished their thought. And if it's reasonable to keep going, I see board presidents just kind of nodding and giving a little bit of body language, like okay, thanks. I don't know if you can see me, but kind of moving your hands, like okay, thanks for coming. And so there's nothing wrong in my view with letting someone finish their thought. And I often see people go 30 seconds or a minute over. I think this is just my 2 cents, but I think if it's going to be a more extended discussion, and the board presidents are in charge of a meeting protocol, if the board president or for that matter another board member says, let's let him talk for a couple more minutes because it's interesting, there's nothing wrong with that. You just want to make sure you do that consistently, because you may have a perception, correct or not, that you let so-and-so talk because they were speaking on a political or policy issue that aligns with you. And then the next person came up, they have a different policy viewpoint that's different. And you said, all right, 3 minutes is up. So people do become quite sensitive to that. So nothing wrong with letting people go on, but you want to try and be as even-handed as possible. And in my view, even-handed means occasionally people go on for an extra minute or 2.
My problem's not when it's actually something that relates to school board and something we can do about it. My problem is when we have like the odd commentary that has nothing to do with school.
Yes, and I think that's the place where I see most people, when the buzzer's up, say, time's up, thank you.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Do you have an audible buzzer? I think I remember you do.
It's not audible. We have a light. We have a light.
A light, okay. Yeah. And, we don't want to be rude to people, but sometimes you just got to keep the meeting going, and I think it's perfectly fine to say, time's up, thanks for coming.
I think probably the time that it's more important to make sure that we keep people doing it is when it's a hot topic that a room full of people that want to talk. And so, because then that can be perceived as letting somebody keep talking that you like what they're saying, as opposed to a person that you don't like what they're saying. I think we're good at that. Yeah, I think we're good at that. And I think that's probably, other times, we don't get that many public comments, really. It's just every once in a while we have a hot topic that that nerd comes in, something's happening in school, and they're very passionate about what's happening. I don't like to tell them, don't feel bad telling them that they have to stop talking. I like to, let them finish. But that really makes you feel like you're not heard. I don't think so either. I think you do a good job.
We also have it in the policy that they can't give any minutes to another speaker.
Oh, yes,
So
there's a
you
lot
could
of...
end up with somebody that, has the soapbox for quite a while if a bunch of people do short comments. So we cut that off.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, and I was going to talk about it on the slide as well. There's a lot of things about parliamentary procedure that people are uncertain about, and surprisingly, the Brown Act doesn't say anything about parliamentary procedure. It doesn't use the word motion. It just says public comment within a reasonable amount of time. So the way you run through your agenda is largely just based on custom and practice and board bylaws. And you're right. I think that was Lisa that said, you can't yield your time to another speaker. That's a perfectly valid rule. You have 3 minutes per speaker, and your board bylaw probably says 20 or 30 minutes per item. And so there's nothing wrong with, for example, if you have a hot topic and you've got 20 people lined up to speak, you could do something like, hey, everybody, we only have 30 minutes for public comment on this item. I see a lot of people lined up. You're welcome to take 3 minutes, but if you want more people to be heard, you could just limit your comments to 1 or 2 minutes, or you could say, I agree with the biggest person. Another tactic I've seen is if there is interest in people still talking, rather than just saying the 30 minutes are up, the board president, I think, can just look around and say, I'm going to ask my colleagues for indulgence to extend the public comment on this for a few more speakers. Is everybody okay with that? And that's done informally all the time. In this lane, a couple board members are commenting. Sometimes when you have a hot topic and people go on longer, there's a concern that you let them go on because you like what they have to say. And Brown Act does specifically say you can't prohibit people from criticizing the agency, and that includes employees. So even if people do come and say some point things about employees which you may disagree with, they do get to speak. Sometimes you can politely remind them that you don't have the leeway to discuss personnel matters, and you would encourage them to bring it up, through appropriate channels. Comments like that are acceptable as long as it's clear that people do get to speak if they want. Okay. Excuse me. Drink water here. Anything else on that before we move into closed session discussion? Okay, I gave you, as I said, our excerpts from our Brown Act handbook, and other Brown Act handbooks also have excerpts that list the closed session agenda descriptions. And in case you may already know this, but I think it's important to remember that these agenda descriptions are taken word for word from the Brown Act. They have 15 or so closed session agenda descriptions that are referred to as the safe harbor agenda descriptions. And the Brown Act specifically says if you use that wording and you stay on the given topic, then you are in compliance with the Brown Act. So we recommend that if people use the closed session agenda descriptions word for word, and any deviations should be occasional. Like, for example, the Brown Act doesn't have a closed session agenda description for student matters. Of course, in the education code, you need to go into closed session for a lot of student matters. So we have to make up our best estimate for what the agenda should say on that. That's one exception. So one thing keep in mind also, aside from the agenda descriptions, is closed session. Everything has to start and end in open session. So you start an open session, you allow public comment on closed session agenda items, and then you recess to closed session. As you see on the slide, you make a brief oral announcement that says we're going to talk about closed session. We're going to take up agenda items 2 through 4 or whatever it is, and then you go back into closed session. You go into closed session, I should say. And then once you're done, you always want to make sure you return to open session so that people can hear any announcements out of closed session, even if the announcement is just no reportable action. So that's a good mantra to remember. The 5 or so items you see on this slide are the most common ones that we see school boards dealing with. There are many about government code claims, insurance, things like that. The public safety one is one that we've got to pause and talk about for a second. It's been in the Brown Act for decades, but people are becoming, recognizing more and more that you may want to talk about safety procedures, like, for example, portions of your school site safety plans or responses to potential threats, and that's something you can go into closed session for. Purpose is pretty broad, but you're generally supposed to be discussing public safety with either public safety staff of your own that have those duties or law enforcement. So it is possible to have that closed session when there's a specific reason. Let's see. Most of the time, we see folks in closed session under student, personnel, and labor negotiations, and thankfully, litigation is somewhat rare. I do want to differentiate for you all the personnel closed session items and just talk about those in some detail because the Brown Act is kind of detailed about them. And if you take a look at the closed session agenda descriptions and the materials that I gave you, there's several of them for labor and negotiations. And in case you have them handy, let's see, it's page 123. Oh, hang on a second. 124 and 125 is where all these public personnel and labor employment descriptions are. And I'm just looking at the descriptions myself for a moment. There's one for conference with labor negotiators. You can discuss both represented and unrepresented employee compensation in that closed session. And the purpose for the labor negotiations sessions is for the district team to have a confidential discussion about what you want to do in labor negotiations as far as language or compensation. And again, that can be represented and unrepresented employees. You know this, and it's something you've done before, but it is good just to pause and remember that it is a pretty flexible agenda item. And you'll also see there's 3 other separate labor personnel agenda descriptions, both on this slide and in the materials. And if you look at the agenda descriptions, you'll see for public employee appointment/employment, that one, the agenda description, you put the job title of the employee under discussion. So what does this discussion look like? It's typically hiring someone or extending their employment contract or appointment, or other perhaps unusual transactions like discussing a change in hours or status. Most school boards don't do a lot of this because the superintendent hires staff, but a lot of school districts also go into closed session to receive information from staff about higher level hires like principals and directors and assistant superintendents and things like that. So the appointment/employment one, again, is usually used for hiring or extending contracts or things like that. Job title, and that's the key thing to remember is the job title is on the agenda there. Same thing with evaluation, the 4th bullet on the slide. Evaluation of job title. And the reason I bring up this is the contrast is for the dismissal release item here, which is the 2nd bullet on the slide, but it's on page 125 in the Brown Act materials that I gave you. The public employee dismissal release item, you don't have a person's name or job title, and that's to protect the privacy of the employee or employees under discussion. This is one of the more flexible closed session agenda descriptions and allows you to receive information from staff and make decisions where decisions are needed from the board on a variety of things. And it could be, a concern that's bubbling up. It could be that there's been a formal complaint filed. It could be that staff are informing you about specific personnel action. It could be releasing someone for probation. It could be talking about something more serious, unfortunately, like termination. So it's a fairly flexible closed session agenda description. It just still needs to relate to a particular employee or employee's personal matter that it needs to be private. And I say private, I'm going to pause on that for a minute. There's a lot of personnel information that is publicly available. Court cases have come down over the past 10, 15 years saying that a fair number of complaints against employees are public documents. Also, the compensation of public employees is publicly available. So when we're talking about closed sessions for personnel, we're talking about really private matters like discipline, evaluation, things like that. Okay, I've been talking for a little while. Did that discussion bring up any questions or comments?
We have an item coming up on our agenda for Thursday that stipulates the name of the individual and the job title. And it's in open session rather than closed.
Thank you for bringing that up. There's a lot of personnel transactions that do happen in open session. Most school boards have what I refer to as the personnel consent agenda, where routine things that are not private are approved. And it could be just routine hires, it could be rehires, it could be retirements, it could be approved leaves of absence, things like that. Does that help?
I believe the item that Trustee Levy is referring to isn't on the consent for personnel action. It's actually a discussion action item regarding hiring an employee under a specific type of credentialing. And so that's a slightly different item, but I do believe that it's just in the format that needs to be in for us to officially hire a specific employee who has a specific credential. And it's a unique item to our.
Yeah, I've never seen one like it before.
I don't think it's on there very often. I've seen it a couple times where it specifically denotes the employee what we're hiring on since we're there.
Oh, good example. There are a lot of odds and ends like that. The education code in your business is full of legal odds and ends. You see things like that for what I refer to as local assignment options, where you need to assign an employee outside of the credential area, or as Michael said, this one could be someone you need board approval to get them onto a waiver or a particular credential. Some of the other things we've seen is we hire retirees. Sometimes there's only limited ways that you can hire retirees, so you need to have a board approval and make some findings that you fit into an exception. So there's a lot of things like that show up on the open session agenda that can be a little surprising, but generally things like credentialing and compensation are publicly available, so it's okay to have them on the open session agenda.
I think what this brings up for me is in the past we've had situations where certain employees in probation are being let go and they've been very loved by the community, and then we get a lot of public input or comments, but at the end of the day we have to say, but we don't have to say sometimes of whether to keep or not keep a employee. And that's, I think, the hard part is that as board members we have tough conversations in closed session, but because it's employee matters we can't share them out in open session. And so that was, I think, a toughie for me, because I feel like we've had really tough conversations in closed session about employees and that have come up, and then there's stuff that's shared with us, and it's like, okay, yeah, we can't keep this person, but then we can't say that or our reason why in open session. So that's a tough one. I think community doesn't understand that aspect of it, or they do it, that's not enough to say this is confidential.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're not happy if there's 5 positions that are probationary employees that are not going to continue, but there's 1 or 2 that were allowed to continue out of the pool or something like that. People want us to come out and report out of closed session which names, and we will say we retain 4 employees and let go 2 probationary employees or something like that. And because we're not allowed to come out and say employee numbers or names in those instances.
Yes, I agree, and I think that disconnect that you're describing is one of the more challenging ones for school boards because you put your finger on the difference. You do have tough conversations in closed session about people's qualities and performance. You can't share that. And I'm often surprised at the kind of impact that employees can make, during the probationary period, and they have parents that like them and don't understand why this might be happening. And yeah, it is challenging because there's not much you can say. Sometimes you can make generic explanations of the fact that release from probation is not disciplinary in nature. It's just a choice to, not to continue to permanency. May not be exactly, enough information for that person either. But yeah, even if you're further staff aren't going to be able to say, what Tom did or didn't do. So it is challenging. There's not a lot of options for giving more information, unfortunately.
This was a place that Byron had, I think, the reason he brought the thing up about our abilities too was he said that a lot of times the staff don't understand that we really are deliberating back there. We're not just back there rubber stamping things that are brought to us. And because they're not allowed to be in closed session, they're not aware of really, the angst that we go through with some of these kind of decisions, particularly with regard to people. That, it's a substantial series of questions and discussion going back and forth. And maybe there's a general way that if we get somebody questioning that in open session to say, we really deliberated on these personnel items and, our decision was made based on input from staff, et cetera, something like that, so that they know that we didn't just go back there and get a list and go, yeah, okay.
If you could capture what you just said for the past 60 seconds, I think that's an excellent summary of things that you could say, which may still not be quite enough information for a concerned community member, but I like what you said, which is we really go over this, and staff go over this, and the board does too, and you should understand we don't take these decisions lightly, and all the things you said, I like it. That's perfectly fine to say, and but it's often hard to stop, because then the community member says, all right, then tell me a little bit more, because it's still not good enough, and at some point you have to say, thanks for coming. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that would make them feel more heard.
I like it. I like your ideas. Okay, is it off to take a 5-minute break, everyone?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll come back in about 5.
All right.
Welcome back, Leslie. Yeah, it's been a good time. I had a great time. It was super fun. Yeah, it was really fun. It's a beautiful country.
Yeah, I've never been to Ireland. I'd love to go. I've been to Scotland, but
I really highly recommend this tour company.
Okay, just following, ready to start again. Alrighty, welcome everyone, I'm sorry about the reporting out part. Reporting out session is an area where I find some schools report things, that requires only for personality report things that change employment status or a final agreement with the unions. And so the things that actually change employment status are hire, termination, resignation, things like that. So when you're in the session talking about it, any dozens of other things come up and there's recommended staff or just discussion, you're not reporting that, it's just changes in employment status. So it's often a point of business clarification for folks. Okay, I actually need to do this joking, don't I? Yeah, there we go. Okay, the other thing I want to pause on is, in rare cases, you need to give an employee what's called 24-hour notice. You may not have seen everyone in recent years, but it's something to pause on and ask often with the assistance of legal counsel. When it says that the board is hearing complaints or charges, you need to give them notice, and the employee has the ability to request an open session hearing on these charges against them. That's the word of ground cases. Reasons is important is that you take their action